The United Nations Climate Summit will be held on September 23rd, along with the Youth Climate Summit a couple days before. Now, the summit will gather the world's leaders to address the climate emergency and to get nations to discuss how to deal with it. There's a lot of misinformation out there, so I do want to talk about how we know the Earth is warming. I'll explain some of the basics on this episode of The Weather Hit. First, let's explain something called the greenhouse effect. It's normal, it's natural, it's been happening on this planet ever since, well, it formed. Gases such as carbon dioxide and methane have been emitted naturally on the Earth's atmosphere throughout history, mainly by volcanic activity. And believe it or not, water vapor is actually also a greenhouse gas. It's important because there has been a level of greenhouse gases that have helped to keep the atmosphere warm enough to sustain life. How? Well, sunlight enters the atmosphere via shortwave radiation. It gets absorbed by the clouds, the atmosphere, and the ground. Some of that is reflected by the clouds and the surface, especially if it's a lighter colored surface, for instance, snow and ice. It then gets emitted as long-wave radiation or infrared radiation. This energy gets absorbed by the clouds and the greenhouse gases and re-emitted. This keeps the planet habitable. But since the 1800s, there have been an increase in greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere. But why? The 19th century was the start of the Industrial Revolution, where greenhouse gases had been emitted unnaturally. It really accelerated by the middle of the 20th century as we started using more fossil fuels, carbon-based substances that we have dug up out of the ground after being there for a very long time. And we are just throwing that carbon back into the atmosphere. The more carbon that is emitted, the more heat that is essentially trapped. This can even create a feedback mechanism where the water warms, releasing more water vapor in the air, melting ice, which decreases the amount of sunlight reflected, which in other words means decreasing the albedo. So it's just simple physics. The more carbon that is thrown in the air, the warmer the global temperature would be. You can't just throw all this in the air and expect absolutely nothing to happen. But hey, how do we know that the atmosphere is warming? Good question. Instrumentation. Our global network of weather stations have shown an increase in the global temperature. But surface weather stations can be unreliable. Satellites don't lie. Satellites are able to derive what the temperature is on Earth. Now, when you look at that data with the land data, it's clear that the planet has been warming. But what about before instrumentation? Ice cores have given us clues as to what the climate was like long before thermometers were invented. Scientists have gone to places where plenty of land ice sits, such as Greenland, with some ice cores going back as far as 80,000 years ago. Scientists have been able to determine using an oxygen isotope and multiple core samples that determine the temperature for the last 12,000 years. But when you look at the last 2,000 years, you can see the spike since the 1800s. And there is good agreement with ice core derived and recorded temperature data between the late 19th and the early 20th centuries. So it's the simple physics of how greenhouse gases can trap heat in the atmosphere and records to back up the claim of a warming world. But we also have other indicators of a warming world. Ocean heat content continues to rise, polar ice is melting at a record pace, and sea level rise. Look, I had some doubts in this area back in the day, but the more research I did, the more I read from peer-reviewed sources and listened to experts in the field, I'm convinced that this is a real thing, that human behaviors are playing a role in a warming planet. All right, that'll be it for this topic for today. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if it gets too carried away, I just may disable the comments altogether because I don't have time for that. Like, dislike, subscribe, do all that jazz, and I will see you all again next time. Thank you for watching.